Now, climate change is something that impacts on all of us, but perhaps the worst affected continent is Africa. And some of the poorest countries are spending a huge proportion of their national budgets to try and clean up the mess it causes, a mess they didn't even make. That's not fair, says one think tank in the UK. The Overseas Development Institute is calling for rich countries to match the amount spent by poorer ones on the problem. They've released a report on the eve of a UN summit in New York on climate change. In a moment, we'll hear from the executive director of the ODI. But first, let's get an idea of what it says African countries are spending. Tanzania allocates $383 million each year to climate change. That's equivalent to 2/3 of all its spending on healthcare. Ethiopia's climate change budget is $440 million, almost half what it spends on primary school education. Uganda spends $25 million each year, with just $2 million coming from overseas. Well, as I said earlier, I spoke to the ODI's executive director, Kevin Watkins, and he told me more about climate change and how it's affecting the African continent.
Well, what we're seeing in Africa is the early warning signs of climate change. And so there are more and more small farmers and rural communities who are having to deal with more severe, more protracted droughts, less certain rainfall. There are urban populations that are facing increased risks of floods and that type of threat. And so governments across the region are having to allocate resources to deal with these very real, very dangerous and very immediate threats. Now, in terms of changing that picture, ultimately this comes down to political decision making in rich countries and the pressure that is put on governments to act.
India and China aren't even sending their heads of state to the summit in New York this week. Again, an incredible lack of political will, isn't there?
It says the climate negotiating process is in a very bad place. There's very high levels of distrust, especially between China and India and the United States and the countries of the European Union. China and India have their own legitimate grievances, but we need them to be part of a global deal. The way to do that is through agreements on technology transfer. It's mutual support, working together to address what is a common issue. There are signs actually that the new Indian government recognises that, and that it recognises that India itself will pay a very high price if there's not an agreement. So I think there are promising signs. We're seeing cities in China introducing carbon trading schemes. Actually, China has gone much further than either the European Union or the United States on renewable energy. So, these are all positive signs, but we need to bring it together in the climate negotiations, and that is not happening at the moment.
How frustrating is this for you?
Well, I think it's desperately frustrating for anyone who cares about international justice and anybody who cares about Africa. The African people ought to be very angry about this. That this is the part of the world with the smallest carbon footprint, if you like. Ethiopian farmers did not contribute to this crisis. They should not be paying the price for the inaction of Western countries. There's a simple solution to this, which we call for in the report, which is that donors should match the efforts of countries like Ethiopia, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, where farmers are already working together to try and address the crisis. It's a simple solution, it's a practical solution, and actually the summit that is happening this week in New York provides an opportunity to move us in that direction.